Hey there, sleepyheads, and welcome back to the quiet corners of history where the clamour of the modern world fades and the echoes of centuries past invite you to drift. Tonight, as the shadows lengthen and the world outside softens into twilight, we're going to embark on a rather peculiar journey. We're going to peel back the romanticized layers of medieval castles, those grand stoic symbols of power and protection, and look at them not as the safe havens you might imagine, but as something far more insidious. Tonight you'll discover how these stone behemoths, despite their imposing facades, were for those who called them home nothing short of death traps. You stand at the gate of a medieval castle, the sheer scale of the stone overwhelming you. It looms a silent grey giant against the horizon, its very existence a statement of power, a brutal testament to a single unyielding principle to render entry lethal for any uninvited guest. Every thick wall, every narrow passage, every shadowed room within its formidable embrace was a calculated instrument of war. This wasn't a home designed for comfort, not in the way you understand comfort. This was a fortress, a weapon fundamentally prioritizing combat effectiveness over anything so soft as human comfort or safety. Such concerns were distant, often disregarded secondary whispers, lost in the echoing halls, mere afterthoughts in every design decision, from the precise thickness of the walls to the strategic, yet often dangerous placement of windows. You see the sheer cold logic of it etched into every rough-hewn stone. This imposing structure, however, was also your home, or at least the place you lived, worked, and quite possibly died. You exist within a rigid feudal system, an inescapable reality, where your place, whether as a lord, a soldier, or a servant, is largely dictated by birthright. There's no upward mobility here, not really. Your life, your very existence, is defined by this hierarchy, and it's a hierarchy that inherently assigns the most dangerous living and working conditions to those at the lower ranks. You understand with a chilling clarity that settles deep in your bones that your life, like that of countless others below the nobility, is deemed more expendable. You are part of the vast complex machine of the castle, a cog whose primary purpose is to ensure the survival and dominance of those above you, regardless of the personal cost. The very architecture of the castle, from the battlements high above your head to the deep foundations beneath your feet, screams of its military imperative. It wasn't built to coddle, it was built to kill. The paramount philosophy in its construction was defense and intruder elimination, a single-minded focus that permeated every design choice, every arrow loop, every machicillation. Every winding staircase was optimized for one thing: to give the advantage to the defender to slow trap and ultimately destroy any who dared to attack. You imagine the architects, perhaps cold-eyed practical men, sketching out blueprints not for cozy hearths or sunlit chambers, but for killing fields, for choke points, for death traps. The air itself seems to hum with this unspoken intent. The paradox of it all begins to settle on you. This very design, crafted with such brutal efficiency to repel external threats, was what ironically transformed the castle into an intimate death trap for its inhabitants. The fortress that was meant to protect you became in countless subtle and overt ways a slow grinding instrument of your potential demise. The formidable appearance that impresses the outside world hides the stark, lethal realities of daily life within these stone walls. You realize that your personal safety was never a design priority, but an unfortunate casualty of its primary purpose. And as you step further inside, you understand that the calculated lethality you see in the architecture was not just for invaders. It was an omnipresent, lurking threat for everyone under its cold stone roof. You feel it yourself, this pervasive intimidation. The sheer mass of the castle isn't just for physical defense. It's a profound psychological weapon. Imagine for a moment that you are an approaching enemy, or perhaps just a peasant from a nearby village bringing tribute or seeking justice. These walls, often 20 feet thick, aren't merely physical barriers. They are demoralizing forces designed to make you feel small, insignificant, utterly crushed by the sheer weight of its power before you even consider drawing a sword. It's a message carved in stone echoing across the landscape. Here lies power, and here lies death for those who challenge it. You understand immediately with a chill that settles deep in your bones that the castle doesn't welcome you. It tolerates you if you belong. If you don't, it promises only oblivion. And then there's the insidious irony that slowly begins to unravel. Every archer's slit, every cleverly placed window, every narrow winding stairwell, every recessed doorway. It was all meticulously calculated. These weren't decorative elements. They were traps designed to maximize defensive advantage, to create killing zones, to give the defenders every possible opportunity to eliminate intruders. A single-minded focus truly on lethality. But you start to notice the cruel paradox. That very focus, that relentless drive to make the castle lethal for outsiders, meant it often became just as lethal for you, its inhabitant. The narrow windows that offer a perfect firing line for archers also plunge your living quarters into perpetual gloom, affecting your health, your mood. The thick walls that stop a battering ram also hold in the bitter cold of winter, making life miserable and potentially fatal. The design in its brutal efficiency was a double-edged sword cutting inward, just as effectively as it cut outward. You might find yourself musing in a quiet moment as you shiver by a meagre fire how a place designed for absolute security could feel so utterly perilous from within. As you settle into the rhythm of castle life, a deeper understanding of survival begins to form. It isn't just about avoiding an invading army or the sudden collapse of a wall. It's about the very basics: food, water, warmth. And this brings you quite naturally to the core economy of the castle and the systemic failures that underpin it. Life here is deeply, profoundly reliant on an agrarian base. The castle doesn't just sit on the land. It is of the land sustained by the fields, the livestock, the harvests from the surrounding manors and villages. You quickly learn that everything from the Lord's grand feast to your own meagre rations revolves around this fundamental truth. Your very existence and the existence of every other person in this stone microcosm is tethered to the success or failure of the crops, the health of the animals, the unpredictable whims of the weather. You'll find yourself counting the days until the next harvest, perhaps even handling sacks of rice, which in some regions or contexts often served as a form of currency, a tangible representation of wealth and sustenance in this self-contained world. It brings a new layer to your understanding of wealth far removed from coin. But despite this fundamental reliance on agriculture resource management within these fortresses, was you soon realize fundamentally flawed. You'd think, wouldn't you, that a place built to withstand sieges for months, even years, would have figured out the basics of, say, not poisoning its own residents with their drinking water. But the reality, as you're about to discover, was a masterclass in unintended self-sabotage. Access to essential uncontaminated resources is a constant quiet struggle. You might find yourself looking at a simple meal, a cup of water, and wondering with a subtle clench of your stomach about its true cost, about the hidden pathogens it might contain. It's a daily gamble, a quiet anxiety that hums beneath the surface of everyday life. The sheer effort to simply exist within these walls, to gather enough uncontaminated food and water to survive another day, is a constant grinding battle that often goes unnoticed in the grand tales of chivalry and siegecraft. You might even find yourself dreaming on a particularly parched day of a simple fresh spring far from the castle walls, a place where water flows clean and unburdened by human presence. And this desperate search for clean water leads you to one of the castle's most insidious yet often overlooked dangers. The very water systems designed to sustain life during a siege, you quickly discover, were systematically vulnerable to contamination. Imagine the castle's well, a vital artery of survival, yet so often dug perilously close to the primitive waste disposal systems. You might not see it, but you can almost taste it in the water. You drink a faint, unsettling metallic tang, a hint of something wrong. Rainwater diligently collected from the roofs and channeled into cisterns often became stagnant, disease-ridden pools. These were not the pristine, refreshing sources you might picture. Instead, they were silent killers, poisoning inhabitants unknowingly, slowly, insidiously. You learn to boil what you can, though fuel is scarce, and even then a knot of unease remains in your gut. Every sip is a quiet act of faith, a gamble against the unseen. You find yourself gazing at the water, a dull greyish film often visible on the surface, and a shiver runs down your spine that has nothing to do with the cold. Then there's the issue of waste management, or rather the stark lack of it. The basic sanitation systems, primarily what are charmingly called guardrobes, little stone closets, where you'd relieve yourself, discharge directly into the moats below, or simply onto the ground beneath the castle walls. You can imagine the pervasive stench, a constant cloying presence that clings to the very stones, a pungent reminder of human existence in its most unglamorous form. This creates a pervasive cycle of contamination, a continuous feedback loop of filth. During heavy rains, you'll witness these systems frequently overflowing, sending raw sewage not just around the base of the castle, but often seeping through the porous stone and cracked foundations into the lower castle levels. Imagine waking to the sight of human waste creeping across the cold stone floor of your chamber, a grim flowing tide spreading disease with every droplet. The smell you soon realise is just the beginning. This unholy confluence of dense human concentration, primitive sanitation, and the omnipresence of rats and fleas creates the perfect breeding grounds for epidemics. You don't need to be a scholar to understand this. You see it with your own eyes, feel it in your own body. Chronicles of the time, if you were to read them, speak of entire garrisons being wiped out, not by enemy swords, but by diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. And then, of course, there was the Black Death, a scourge that found optimal transmission conditions within these crowded, unhygienic stone fortresses. You live with the constant gnawing fear of sickness, a silent, invisible enemy more terrifying than any army. A cough, a fever, a sudden cramping in your stomach, each is a potential death sentence. You watch your neighbours, your friends, your family members sicken and waste away, and you know with a grim certainty that you might be next. The castle, in its attempt to wall out external threats, inadvertently created a hothouse for internal annihilation. And even if you manage to avoid the invisible horrors of disease, you face the chilling, tangible threat of cold. Heating these vast stone structures demands enormous quantities of fuel. Imagine the sheer logistics of it, cutting down entire forests, hauling tons of wood or charcoal, just to bring a fleeting inadequate warmth to a few chambers. This leads to perpetual scarcity and an almost maddening competition for resources. You'll find yourself shivering, huddled by a brazier that offers little comfort, your breath misting in the air, your fingers numb with cold. Sometimes the desperation for warmth reaches such a peak that inhabitants are forced to burn essential wooden elements of the castle itself, beams, floorboards, perhaps even furniture, further compromising its structural integrity and, ironically, its long-term livability. You watch as a precious piece of the castle is sacrificed to the flames, a tangible piece of its history, and you feel the biting cold in your bones, a constant reminder of the precarious balance between survival and decay. You quickly grasp that there is a profound absence of systemic relief in this unforgiving environment. Should widespread issues like famine or disease strike, issues exacerbated by the very conditions of the castle, mind you, you'll find there's little to no organised societal support. There are no robust public health infrastructures, no centralised relief efforts as you understand them in your modern world. Each individual, each family, each small household within the castle walls is largely on their own. When the plague comes or when the harvest fails, you're left vulnerable and isolated, perhaps relying only on the meagre charity of a lord who himself is often grappling with the same existential threats. albeit from a position of relative comfort. The lack of a safety net is a chilling reality. You realise that your survival truly depends on your own grit, your own ingenuity, and perhaps a great deal of luck. This isolation, this systemic vulnerability, underscores how truly perilous daily life within these imposing structures could be. You might find yourself staring out of a narrow window, perhaps at the desolate landscape in winter, and feeling a profound sense of loneliness, a silent, unspoken question of who, if anyone, would care if you simply faded away. And this constant battle against the elements and unseen forces brings you to nature's relentless fury, and how the castle, despite its stone, might possess its own systemic vulnerabilities. Those massive stone walls, the very things that provide such formidable protection, also act as enormous thermal conductors. Think of them as colossal thermal sinks. In summer they might absorb and radiate heat, making interiors stifling. But in winter, they relentlessly draw heat from interior spaces, creating a bone-chilling cold that permeates the entire structure. You find yourself constantly shivering, wrapped in layers of wool, your breath misting even indoors. This isn't just discomfort. It leads to systemic issues like hypothermia and frostbite, particularly among the vulnerable. The very young, the very old, and those whose duties keep them in exposed areas. You might find yourself trying to write a letter, your fingers stiff and aching, or perhaps attempting to mend a garment, your needles clumsy with cold. The cold, you realise, is not just an inconvenience. It's a constant, insidious threat, slowly leaching the warmth from your body day after day, night after night. You might even begin to dread the setting of the sun, knowing the relentless chill that will follow. Then there's the relentless freeze-thaw decay. Winter's brutal cycles mercilessly exploit tiny, almost invisible cracks in the castle masonry. Water seeps into these fissures, freezes, expands, and then thaws, contracting. This constant expansion and contraction gradually splits stones imperceptibly at first, then more dramatically weakening walls, roofs, and even entire sections of the castle. You might hear strange groaning sounds from the stone on a particularly cold night, or the unsettling creak of timbers as the frost begins its silent work. This isn't a slow, graceful aging. It's a relentless, destructive process capable of sudden, unheralded collapses that can trap and kill inhabitants without warning. Imagine sleeping soundly, only to be awoken by the terrifying roar of crumbling stone, the dust and debris choking your lungs, the sudden bone-crushing weight of a ceiling that was there just moments before. You learn to listen to the castle, to the subtle sounds of its decay, a constant low thrum of anxiety. It's a structure that is both your protector and in its very essence slowly self-destructing, taking you with it if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. You might find yourself quietly developing a new and distinct wariness for overhead architecture. Your sleep, you realise, just acquired a subtle new background hum of anxiety. You soon realise that the castle's structural integrity, while impressive from a distance, harboured inherent flaws stemming directly from the materials used. They didn't have the luxury of modern standardised building codes or sophisticated geological surveys. Instead, they used what was available local stone, often of inconsistent quality. You might notice some sections are built from porous stone which readily absorbs moisture, or iron-rich stone prone to staining like dried blood. After a long rain, a grim omen etched into the very facade. This stone, while abundant, was also prone to cracking, especially under the relentless assault of the freeze-thaw cycles you've already observed. And then there was the timber. They used green, unseasoned timber cut fresh from the forests and incorporated directly into the construction. Logically, what happens to unseasoned wood? It shrinks, it warps, it twists. But here within the castle's massive weight, this isn't just an aesthetic flaw. It introduces inherent weaknesses into the castle's very fabric, leading to unpredictable bone-crushing failures. A beam might split without warning, a floorboard might sag and then splinter, dropping you into the darkness below. You learn to walk carefully to avoid leaning too heavily on anything, to trust only your own 2 feet on solid ground. Adding to this precarious existence is the pervasive dampness. The architectural priority, as you recall, was defence, not drainage. This meant structures were designed to be thick, to be impermeable to invaders, but not necessarily to moisture. The result is a perpetually damp, humid environment. You can feel it in the air, a clammy chill that never quite leaves you. Your clothes feel perpetually slightly damp, your skin prickles with an unending humidity. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's a breeding ground for structural decay. Wooden supports rot, silently crumbling from within. The mortar, often mixed with organic matter for binding, crumbles under the constant assault of moisture. You might push on a wall and feel a slight give, hear a faint unsettling crunch. And of course this damp, poorly ventilated atmosphere is perfect for the flourishing of moulds and diseases. You see the greenish-black patches blooming on walls and shadowed corners, smell the musty, earthy odour of decay, and you know deep in your gut that this environment is actively working against your health slowly, insidiously. It's a quiet, damp enemy just as formidable as any army. And then you consider the very defensive elements that make the castle so formidable, and you realise how easily they can turn inward. Take the gatehouses, for example. They are meticulously crafted killing grounds, multiple drawbridges that can be raised to strand you in the open portcullises, those massive iron grills that can plummet down to trap or crush you. Outer wards are designed as killing grounds, narrow enclosed spaces where attackers can be showered with projectiles. Barbicans, those fortified outworks, funnel attackers into narrow exposed passages, making them easy targets. These features are brilliant, yes, but they contain insidious weaknesses, particularly for the inhabitants. A heavy portcullis designed to crash down on an enemy could just as easily plummet without warning during a routine inspection, crushing a careless guard or a distracted servant beneath its immense weight. You learn to step lively near these mechanisms, to never assume they are safe. You begin to see the castle not just as a static structure, but as a collection of potential traps, always active, always waiting even for you. Similarly, those ominous openings known as murder holes and machicolations, the projecting structures from which defenders could drop stones, boiling water, or even quicklime onto attackers below, create permanent weak points in the stonework. You might not see it from a distance, but up close you notice the stress fractures, the slight crumbling around their edges. Constant moisture combined with the corrosive effects of whatever foul substances were poured through them during a siege further weakens the surrounding masonry. You've heard the stories, perhaps seen the evidence, chunks of stone breaking away, plummeting onto unsuspecting inhabitants below, turning what should be safe passages into sudden lethal death traps. You walk quickly beneath them, a slight tightening in your chest, a subconscious prayer that today isn't the day a piece of medieval history decides to redecorate the floor with your skull. The castle, you realise, is a place of constant low-level vigilance, where even the air you breathe carries a hidden danger. The air itself, you realise, is a hazard within these thick stone walls. The narrow arrow slits and small windows primarily designed for defence, and not for pleasant views or fresh breezes, severely limit natural light and critically ventilation. Imagine living in a space where the air is stagnant, often fetid, thick with the odours of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, animal waste, and the ever-present cloying scent of damp stone and mildew. This isn't just unpleasant. It's a miasma that contributes to chronic respiratory ailments. You might find yourself coughing more often, your lungs feeling heavy, persistent tickle in your throat. And in this poorly ventilated environment, another more silent killer lurks: carbon monoxide. From poorly vented fires in the hearths, it could silently accumulate, a colourless, odourless gas suffocating inhabitants in their sleep. You might wake with a headache, feeling groggy and disoriented, not realising how close you came to never waking at all. The very air you breathe, the lifeblood of your existence, becomes another weapon in the castle's arsenal against you, its unwitting inhabitant. Even with such formidable foundations designed for protection, you begin to understand that the daily realities within these stone behemoths proved just as deadly. They turned mundane existence into a constant gamble with death. The formidable design that rendered castles impervious to external threats simultaneously turned them into intimate death traps for their residents. Every routine task, every seemingly safe space harboured the potential for sudden injury, or a slow, agonising demise. You might be carrying a bucket of water down a winding staircase, or tending to the hearth, or simply lying in your bed, and death in its myriad forms could be just a breath away. This is not the grand heroic narrative of knights and ladies. This is the quiet, grinding reality of survival in a stone cage. Let's delve deeper into these living conditions, the very shelter that was supposed to protect you. The castle interiors you quickly discover are profoundly claustrophobic. The thick stone walls, while providing security, also create a crushing sense of enclosure. The passages are narrow, winding, and often dark, offering little to no personal space. Imagine sharing a room, or even just a corner of a hall with multiple other people day in and day out with no real escape. This intensifies feelings of confinement and isolation, particularly during prolonged sieges when the gates are barred, or during the brutal, interminable winters when you are truly locked within these frigid walls. You feel the weight of the stone pressing in on you, a physical manifestation of your lack of freedom. There's a constant low hum of anxiety that comes from never truly being alone, never having a place where your thoughts aren't potentially overheard, where your movements aren't observed. It's enough to make you feel like a caged bird constantly fluttering against unseen bars. And that feeling of claustrophobia is only intensified by the perpetual gloom and cold. Natural light, a luxury you rarely appreciate in your modern life, is a precious, scarce commodity here. It filters through narrow, defensive slits, mere slivers of brightness that leave much of the castle in perpetual shadow. You rely on flickering torches and oil lamps which cast unsettling, dancing shadows, making familiar corners seem menacing, creating an atmosphere that is both oppressive and eerie. Coupled with those massive stone walls that radiate cold temperatures remain brutally frigid for much of the year. You find your breath misting in the air even indoors. Wine, if you're lucky enough to have it, turns to slush in your cup. The cold seeps into your bones, a constant ache that never truly leaves you. It impacts your sleep, your mood, your very ability to function. You long for sunlight, for warmth, for any reprieve from the biting, relentless chill that is as much a part of the castle as the stone itself. As you navigate the castle, you quickly become acutely aware of the hazardous floors and furniture that populate your daily life. Floors, whether they are elaborately tiled in the Lord's chambers or simply packed earth, covered with rushes and straw in the common areas, pose constant tripping hazards. Those ornate tiles, beautiful as they may be, become treacherously slippery when wet, especially when you're moving quickly, perhaps carrying a heavy load. In the lower halls, the packed earth covered with rushes and straw isn't much better. It conceals dangerous obstacles, hiding uneven surfaces, dropped items, or even small sharp pieces of debris. Worse still, these rushes and straw are rarely changed, becoming a teeming ecosystem of filth, harbouring vermin and disease. You learn to walk with a careful shuffling gait, your eyes often fixed on the ground lest a misstep send you tumbling. And then there's the furniture. Not the sleek, lightweight pieces you're accustomed to, but massive, crudely constructed wooden items built for display and durability rather than safety or comfort. Imagine a heavy wooden chest with an ill-fitting lid that could slam shut on your fingers, or a table with uneven legs that wobbles precariously. These pieces, often weighing hundreds of pounds, could topple with bone-crushing force. You might hear the chilling anecdote of a half-ton chair at Warwick Castle that reportedly claimed 3 earls. You might find yourself quietly wondering if it's currently accepting applications for a 4th. Whether precisely true or not, the story serves as a grim warning, a palpable fear that any large unstable piece of furniture could, without warning, become an instrument of your demise. You learn to give wide berth to heavy armoires, to never stand too close to an overstuffed and top-heavy chair. Your daily interactions with the objects around you become another subtle dance with danger, a constant awareness of their potential to harm. Even your sleeping quarters, the place where you seek rest and respite, are fraught with danger. If you're a servant or part of the lower ranks, you're likely relegated to communal sleeping arrangements on rarely changed vermin-infested straw pallets. Imagine the constant itch of lice, the restless crawl of fleas, the knowledge that every night you are sharing your bed with countless unseen creatures. These conditions, combined with the close proximity of many bodies, promote rapid disease transmission. A cough from one person quickly becomes a widespread affliction. Even if you are a noble granted the luxury of a four-poster bed, you're not entirely safe. These beds, with their heavy wooden frames and thick privacy curtains, were prone to collapse from rotting rope supports, which stretched and weakened over time. And the thick curtains, while offering a semblance of privacy in a crowded world, could create enclosed, oxygen-deprived conditions conducive to suffocation if the chamber was poorly ventilated or a nearby fire consumed too much air. You might drift off to sleep, feeling the slight sway of the ropes beneath you, a subconscious worry about the integrity of your bed, a silent prayer that tonight at least it will hold. And then there's the unseen yet ever-present threat of fire. Despite the castle being built predominantly of stone, its interiors were tinder boxes. Imagine wooden furnishings often unvarnished and bone-dry from years of use, tapestries adorning the walls rich in flammable fibres, straw scattered on the floors as insulation or bedding. All these elements create an environment ripe for disaster. Open flames for heating often, in massive uncontained hearths, and for lighting flickering torches, crude oil lamps were ubiquitous. Combine this with poor compartmentalization, meaning fires could spread rapidly from one room to another through connecting passages and wooden staircases. You might hear the chilling account of the Windsor Castle fire of 1296, which, though primarily stone, was ravaged by flames consuming its wooden interiors. A fire once started could spread with terrifying speed, turning stone rooms into infernos that trapped inhabitants. You envision the smoke thick and choking the heat unbearable, the stone walls becoming ovens, trapping you within your supposed sanctuary. The very walls meant to protect you from the outside become a deadly barrier preventing your escape from the raging inferno within. Winter. You quickly learn transforms the castle from a merely dangerous place into a truly lethal embrace. Those massive stone walls that offer protection from invaders also ensure that temperatures inside often barely surpass those outside. Imagine waking up morning after morning, your breath misting in the frigid air, the cold seeping into your very bones. It's not just a discomfort, it's a constant pervasive threat. You see it in the vulnerability of the very young and the very old, their bodies unable to generate enough warmth to fend off the relentless chill. Widespread hypothermia becomes a quiet killer, taking lives without the dramatic flair of a battle. And then there's the ice. It forms on interior walls, making them slick and treacherous to the touch. It forms on stairs, transforming routine ascents and descents into death-defying acts of balance. Every surface becomes a potential trap, contributing to falls and injuries that in this era, without modern medical care, could easily prove fatal. A broken leg, a simple concussion from a slip on an icy stone could be the beginning of the end for you. You learn to move slowly, deliberately, as if navigating a minefield, constantly aware of the treacherous surfaces beneath your feet. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, your very sustenance, the food you eat, the water you drink, is a constant source of quiet dread. Daily diets, you quickly discover, are often bland, monotonous, and terrifyingly contaminated. You'll become intimately familiar with stale bread, perhaps the cornerstone of every meal, and this bread, innocent as it may seem, could contain ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. You might not know its name, but you'd certainly know its effects: hallucinations, convulsions, and ultimately death. This isn't just theory. It was a grim reality for many. Your ale, often consumed because water was deemed unsafe, was frequently polluted with disease-causing bacteria. You drink it not for pleasure but out of necessity, hoping that the fermentation process has somehow cleansed it. But a knot of unease remains in your gut. And the water, even when available, was often contaminated by sewage seepage, as you've already begun to suspect. In winter, the situation becomes even more desperate. With wells frozen, desperate inhabitants might resort to melting snow for water. But imagine the snow collected from around the castle, contaminated with animal waste and human refuse that had been discharged from the guardrabes. You melt it, you drink it, and you pray that the cold has somehow purified it. But the risk is immense, and you often find yourself with a queasy stomach, the taste of something vaguely metallic and unpleasant clinging to your tongue. Every meal, every sip is a quiet act of faith, a gamble with the very substance that is meant to sustain you. The very places where food is stored, the castle granaries and storerooms designed for siege resilience, are breeding grounds for vermin. You see the rats, sleek and bold, scurrying across the floor in the dim light, their eyes glinting in the gloom. They are more than just a nuisance, they are disease vectors. They spread diseases like the bubonic plague through contaminated food stores, their tiny claws and bodies carrying the pathogens that could wipe out an entire household. And the grain itself, stored in damp, unventilated conditions, often becomes mouldy, producing lethal toxins. You might notice a strange taste in your porridge, a subtle bitterness, and wonder if this is the beginning of the end. You learn to eat quickly, to not think too much about where your food has been, to simply be grateful that there is food at all. You pick at your plate, your appetite dulled by the ever-present uncertainty, and a chilling question lingers in your mind: will this meagre meal be the one that finally betrays you? The heart of the castle. The kitchens are chambers of extreme heat and choking smoke, truly a place of constant hazard. Imagine massive, constantly roaring hearths, filling the air with the smell of wood smoke and cooking fats, a thick, acrid haze that makes your eyes water and your lungs ache. Kitchen staff, toiling long hours in these brutal conditions, suffered chronic lung damage from the perpetual smoke inhalation. You might see their faces perpetually smudged with soot, their eyes red-rimmed, their coughs deep and rattling. But the dangers go beyond long-term ailments. Severe burns from exploding pottery which could shatter under extreme heat, or from scalding liquids, vast cauldrons of boiling water or simmering stews were common occurrences. The worst accidents, however, involved staff collapsing unconscious from heat stroke or exhaustion, falling directly into their own cooking fires. You can only imagine the screams, the frantic efforts to pull them out, the smell of burning flesh that would linger in the air for days. It's a gruesome, terrifying reality that underscores the extreme danger of what should be the most life-sustaining part of the castle. The act of cooking itself, a seemingly mundane chore, was fraught with peril. Imagine immense unstable cauldrons often suspended over open flames by crude chains or hooks. These could tip without warning, spilling their boiling contents onto anyone nearby. A moment's distraction, a slight bump, a worn chain, and suddenly a torrent of scalding liquid could engulf a cook or an assistant. And then there were the knives, razor-sharp necessary tools used in dim, smoke-filled environments, where visibility was often poor and fatigue was constant. These conditions led to frequent gruesome accidents, deep cuts, severed fingers, even more severe mutilations. Such injuries, seemingly minor to you with your modern medical knowledge, often proved fatal due to the complete lack of proper wound care or antibiotics. A simple cut could quickly turn gangrenous, leading to a slow, agonizing death from infection. You learn to move with extreme caution in the kitchen, to always be aware of the boiling pots and the flashing blades. a silent prayer on your lips that you won't be the next victim of a routine task gone horribly wrong. The methods of food preservation, primitive by modern standards, meant meat spoiled quickly. You might open a barrel of salted meat and be greeted by a putrid odour, a greenish tint to the flesh that turns your stomach. Salt crucial for preservation was often expensive and used sparingly, meaning much of the food stored for winter or sieges was barely edible. But even worse, the salt itself could be contaminated with lead and other poisons inadvertently added during the crude refining process or through storage in lead-lined containers. Consuming such contaminated food led to slow, agonizing illnesses among the castle population. Chronic stomach pains, neurological damage, even death. You might see someone suffering from the effects, their skin pale, their movements shaky, their mind clouded, and not truly understand the source of their torment. To make matters worse, the constant exposure to smoke and strong odours in the kitchen dulled the cook's senses. Imagine trying to detect the subtle signs of spoiled food when your nostrils are constantly assaulted by the smell of wood smoke roasting meat and human waste. This sensory dulling meant that dangerously rotten food could easily go unnoticed and be served. And beyond deliberate spoilage, there was the terrifying risk of accidental poisoning from foraging, the accidental harvesting of poisonous plants like deadly nightshade, which could easily be mistaken for edible berries by an untrained eye, or the misidentification of toxic mushrooms found in the surrounding forests led to internal poisoning that could kill entire families. This highlights the daily gamble with every meal, a constant low-level anxiety that permeated the act of eating. You pick at your plate, your appetite dulled by a low hum of anxiety, a grim understanding that with every bite you engage in a daily gamble, hoping this meal isn't secretly your undoing. Beyond the dangers of food, you begin to truly understand the grim realities of hygiene and personal care within the castle walls. Life here is not about cleanliness as you know it. The castle latrines, those garderobes you've already heard about discharging directly into the moats, or onto the ground, create ubiquitous contamination. You see the flies buzzing, you smell the stench, and you know with a sickening certainty that disease is constantly circulating. In winter, when temperatures plummet, garderobe chutes could freeze, causing human waste to back up into living quarters. Imagine the horror-raw sewage not only refusing to leave, but actually returning to your living space, intensifying the unbearable stenches and accelerating the spread of diseases like dysentery and typhoid fever. You learn to hold your breath to avoid certain areas, to simply endure the pervasive filth that is an inescapable part of your daily life. Your concept of personal space, and indeed personal cleanliness, begins to warp under the sheer pressure of this reality. Bathing, you quickly realize, was a rare and often dangerous luxury considered unhealthy by many due to the prevailing medical theories of the time. When it did occur, the water was a precious commodity often heated with great effort and then frequently shared among multiple people. Imagine a large tub of water used by one person, then another, becoming a veritable soup of bacteria and parasites by the time it reached your turn. The thought alone makes your skin crawl. And the act of acquiring this water was itself fraught with peril. Drawing water from deep contaminated wells meant navigating narrow, damp spiral staircases. This daily gymnastics routine on narrow, damp spiral staircases presented the very real chance of a terminal plunge into the murky depths below. You learn to value a small basin of warm water, even if it's murky, and to perform a quick, efficient wash, knowing that true cleanliness is a distant, unattainable dream. Lice, fleas and bedbugs are not just an occasional nuisance here. They're constant companions for all castle inhabitants, regardless of social status. You learn to live with a perpetual itch, the restless nights spent scratching. They infest your straw bedding, your clothes, even your hair. These tiny creatures are more than just an annoyance. They act as vectors for serious diseases like typhus and plague, turning your sleeping quarters into literal breeding grounds for illness. You try to pick them off to burn the straw when you can, but it's a losing battle. The constant presence of these parasites, the persistent low-level irritation gnaws at your sense of well-being, eroding your comfort, and reminding you every waking and sleeping moment of the grim reality of your existence. You might even find yourself envying the spiders, those silent predators, who at least are creating webs to catch something. And what happens when sickness inevitably strikes? The isolation of castles means that professional medical help, if it even exists in a form you would recognise, is often days, if not weeks away. A journey through treacherous lands to reach a skilled physician, if one can be found, is a luxury afforded to very few. For most simple infections from minor cuts, like the hypothetical kitchen maid Agnes at Killilea Castle, who might have nicked her finger while chopping vegetables, could quickly turn gangrenous and fatal without antibiotics or proper wound care. A minor injury, something you'd bandage and forget in your modern life here, becomes a terrifying death sentence. You watch as a loved one's limb swells, turns black, the infection creeping inexorably upwards, and you are helpless to stop it. Medieval medical knowledge, you quickly ascertain, was primitive at best and often alarmingly counterproductive. Treatments were frequently more harmful than the original injury or ailment. Imagine suffering from a fever, and the common response is to bleed you, a practice believed to remove bad humours, but which only served to weaken an already sick individual. Crude amputations performed without anaesthesia or sterile conditions were common for severe injuries, a horrifying spectacle you pray you never witness firsthand, let alone undergo. Ineffective poultices made from various herbs and sometimes even animal dung were applied to wounds, often introducing more infection than they healed. These interventions, rather than alleviating suffering, often compounded it, increasing mortality rates for illnesses that would be easily treatable today. You realise that falling ill is not just an inconvenience, it is a terrifying lottery with the odds heavily stacked against you. The very act of seeking help could paradoxically accelerate your demise. And this brings you to the daily labour and responsibilities that fill your waking hours, each imbued with its own hidden dangers. Simply moving within the castle is fraught with peril. Imagine climbing uneven, worn spiral stairs designed to disorient an attacking right-handed swordsman, but now a constant challenge in the perpetual darkness. A misstep on a slippery stone, a moment of distraction, and you could easily tumble down, breaking bones or even your neck. Navigating pitch-black corridors, relying solely on touch, means feeling along cold, damp walls that could conceal sharp projections, loose stones, or sudden fatal drops, perhaps, where a defensive mechanism once was. These were not just theoretical dangers, they led to countless broken bones, sprains, and even deaths. You learn to move with a heightened sense of awareness, every step a calculated risk, every shadowed corner a potential ambush for your unwary feet. The castle architecture itself, the very structure meant to protect you, was a source of constant mundane accidents. Beyond the daily slips and trips, you learn of more catastrophic events. Inhabitants fell from narrow, railingless wall walks high above the ground, often during routine patrols or simply while observing the landscape. You hear tales of figures like Lady Helena de Montfort or William of Ashp, whose lives were abruptly ended by a misstep on a treacherous spiral staircase or a gust of wind on a battlements. Great hall galleries, those elevated platforms where musicians or observers might stand, were known to collapse, as in the chilling fate of Roger Mortimer, plunging occupants to their death below. And as you've already noted, large unstable furniture could topple, crushing unsuspecting occupants. The castle, you realise, is not a static, safe environment, but a dynamic, unpredictable space, where the very stones and timbers can conspire against you. The castle's structural integrity, you observe, was consistently compromised over time by age-relentless weather, and often by poor construction techniques. Medieval mortar, a crucial binding agent, was particularly vulnerable to the freeze-thaw cycle you now understand so well. This constant expansion and contraction loosened stones, allowing them to fall without warning. You might hear the story of Sir Hugh Deasy, tragically killed by a falling ceiling stone at Conway Castle, a chilling reminder that danger could literally fall from above at any moment. And the massive wooden beams that supported the great halls, impressive as they seemed, could suddenly collapse, creating vertical shafts of destruction, bringing down floors and ceilings in a terrifying cascade. You learn to listen to the sounds of the castle, the creaks and groans, and to wonder with a constant unease if that particular sound is merely the wind or something far more ominous, the sound of your world slowly coming apart around you. The castle, you realise, served as a stark amplifier for human folly, transforming a solitary ruler's deteriorating mind into a widespread catastrophe for all within its reach. If your duties led you to the castle's workshops, you found yourself immersed in yet another layer of pervasive dangers. Imagine the blacksmith shop's cacophonous caverns of clanging metal, filled with choking smoke from the forges. Beyond the noise, you were exposed to toxic fumes from the metals being worked. Lead and mercury used in various processes could cause tremors, mental confusion, and a slow, insidious poisoning that left workers debilitated. The deafening noise alone could lead to permanent hearing loss, leaving you with a constant ringing in your ears long after you left the forge. In the carpentry shops, the air was thick with sawdust, a constant fire risk from the open flames used for light and heat. And the tools, crude, unpredictable, lacking any modern safety features, were a constant source of severe injuries. Imagine axes slipping saws, binding chisels, glancing off the wood and plunging into flesh. Cuts, lacerations, severed digits were common occurrences, and as you already know in this era, a simple cut could easily turn fatal due to infection. You see the calloused hands, the missing fingers, the grim faces of those who worked in these dangerous trades, and you understand the quiet bravery it took to simply show up for work each day. Even the domestic animals, vital to castle life for food transport and protection, posed significant threats. Horses essential for travel and warfare, but stressed by confinement in cramped stables, could become unpredictable. A sudden kick, a panicked bolt, and a stable hand could be trampled beneath their powerful hooves. Dogs used for hunting, guarding, and companionship could turn rabid spreading disease through bites before the danger was even recognised. You learn to move carefully around the stables, to respect the power of the animals, to watch for the subtle signs of agitation in their eyes. A gentle nudge from a cow could send you sprawling, a playful nip from a dog could break the skin. These not cuddly pets, but working animals capable of inflicting serious harm. Winter, as you've already seen, amplified every existing danger, transforming routine tasks into death-defying endeavours. Imagine patrolling icy battlements, where a single misstep could send you plummeting to the frozen ground far below. Or picture the desperate attempts to obtain water from frozen moats or wells. The ice, often thin and deceptive, could give way without warning, leading to fatal drownings as inhabitants fell through their bodies, trapped in the frigid water until the spring thaw. You might hear the story of someone who vanished only to be found months later, a grim testament to winter's brutal, unrelenting toll. The struggle for basic necessities, the simple act of staying hydrated, became a life-or-death mission, where the elements themselves conspired against you. And perhaps most terrifyingly, the castle itself could become a fire trap, turning the stone walls into an oven. You recall the vulnerability of the wooden interiors. The rapid spread of fire through combustible furnishings and structures meant that a spark could quickly ignite an inferno. The narrow staircases, cleverly designed to slow attacking forces, became bottlenecks for fleeing residents, trapping them within the blazing structure. Records speak chillingly of victims who burned alive, unable to escape their stone prison. You might hear of such a tragedy, perhaps the Pembroke Castle fire, and the image of those trapped within the stone walls consumed by flames haunts your dreams. The very sanctuary became a tomb, its protective design transforming into a lethal barrier sealing the fate of those inside. Beyond these physical tolls, you begin to grasp that the castle's imposing presence and internal workings cast a long, dark shadow over the mental and emotional well-being of its inhabitants. It transformed into a death trap for the human spirit itself, eroding resilience, fostering paranoia, and shaping a unique form of madness. The unyielding walls of medieval castles you now understand, while offering a formidable physical protection, paradoxically created profound psychological death traps. Imagine being confined within these stone behemoths, not for days or weeks, but for months, even years, in what felt like an unending siege against your own spirit. This prolonged isolation enforced by the castle's often remote locations trapped inhabitants in an environment where the constant presence of thick walls and moats created a visceral sense of being buried alive in a stone tomb. You might look out from a narrow arrow slit, seeing only a sliver of the distant world, and feel a crushing weight of confinement, a profound sense of being cut off from everything and everyone you once knew. This isn't just loneliness. It's a deep-seated psychological oppression slowly eroding your mental fortitude. This feeling of isolation is compounded by a pervasive fear and paranoia that permeates every corner of the castle. The very design elements you once admired for their defensive ingenuity now seem to mock you. Those murder holes, designed to rain death upon besiegers, become hungry mouths overhead, a constant grim reminder of violence. Arrow slits offering a defender's vantage point feel like sinister eyes, always watching, always judging. This architectural language of war serves as a daily grim reminder of the brutal realities of the world outside and the violence that could erupt at any moment within. It fosters a constant fear and paranoia that seeps into every interaction, leaving inhabitants perpetually on edge. You find yourself scanning faces, questioning motives, wondering who might be listening, who might be plotting. Trust becomes a fragile, dangerous commodity. And within this rigid, claustrophobic world, natural human expression is severely stifled. Imagine a society where rigid social hierarchies dictate every word, every gesture. As a servant, you risk severe punishment for speaking too freely, for uttering a thought out of turn, for expressing even a flicker of personal opinion. As a noble, you fear showing any emotional weakness, any vulnerability that could be exploited by rivals or perceived as a chink in your armour. This fosters a culture of profound self-censorship, genuine expression, raw emotion, heartfelt connection. These become dangerous liabilities. You learn to guard your words, to keep your true feelings locked away, to present a carefully constructed facade to the world. It's a psychological straitjacket slowly strangling your ability to truly be yourself, forcing you into a performance where authenticity is a risk you cannot afford. You feel the weight of unspoken words, the dull ache of unexpressed emotion. The stone chambers and vaulted ceilings, while impressive, amplify every sound. This creates constant acoustic stress, a world where true privacy is impossible. Every creak of a floorboard, every muffled cough from a neighbouring chamber, every hushed conversation carried on the wind. It all echoes, bounces, and is magnified. You learn to whisper, to communicate in subtle glances and gestures, or to develop elaborate silent communication systems to avoid being overheard. This enduring psychological pressure of never being truly alone, of never being able to speak freely, to know that your most intimate moments or thoughts might be inadvertently exposed, grinds away at your spirit. You long for silence, for the quiet peace of your own thoughts, but the castle denies you even that. It's a constant invasion, a relentless chipping away at your sense of personal sanctuary. The culmination of prolonged confinement, the poor air quality you've grown accustomed to, and the chronic stress of daily life in the castle often contributed to a gradual deterioration of mental faculties. This unique phenomenon was in some anecdotal accounts even termed stone sickness. Imagine finding yourself experiencing memory loss, small but unsettling lapses that become more frequent. You might observe violent outbursts in others, inexplicable rages that seem to erupt from nowhere, or even find yourself prone to them. And perhaps most chillingly, there's the peculiar delusion of hearing the stones themselves whispering, a phenomenon born from isolation and paranoia, a haunting echo in the quiet moments of the night, as if the castle itself is speaking secrets to you. This isn't just a metaphor. It's a very real psychological toll, a slow descent into a unique form of madness, induced by the very environment designed to protect. You find yourself questioning your own sanity, wondering if the walls are indeed closing in, if the shadows truly hold unseen figures, or if it is merely your mind succumbing to the crushing weight of this existence. The seasons themselves exert a profound psychological toll. Winter's long nights and short grey days amplify despair. The endless cold, the perpetual gloom, the lack of natural light and the limited social interaction combine to create a perfect storm for seasonal depression. You see increased rates of what you might call melancholy, and in the most desperate cases, even suicide. People become withdrawn, listless, their spirits slowly extinguished by the oppressive environment. Volatile behaviour due to cabin fever becomes common as tempers fray and small annoyances escalate into furious arguments. Conversely, the arrival of spring with its sudden burst of light and warmth could trigger manic episodes driving lords into reckless military campaigns, as if the sudden release from winter's gloom unleashed a chaotic energy that manifested in dangerous, impulsive decisions. The castle, you see, reflected and amplified the extremes of the natural world, turning the ebb and flow of the seasons into another unpredictable challenge to your mental well-being. Ultimately, the cumulative psychological pressures often led inhabitants to give up the will to live. This wasn't always a dramatic sudden act, but a slow, quiet fading. You might observe someone wasting away their appetite, gone, their eyes vacant, as if their spirit had simply departed, leaving only a hollow shell. Others might turn to alcohol, seeking a fleeting escape from the crushing reality, only to sink deeper into despair and physical ruin. Still others became obsessed with death, composing elaborate funeral plans for themselves or others, as if embracing the inevitable offered a perverse form of control in a world where control was so scarce. And in the most desperate cases, consumed by despair and the relentless pressure, some would choose to end their torment throwing themselves from the castle walls, a final, tragic act of defiance against their stone prison. You understand with a sombre clarity that for many the castle was a slow psychological death sentence, a place where the human spirit withered and died long before the body gave out. Yet amidst this pervasive danger and psychological pressure, you observe the emergence of elaborate superstitions. These aren't just quaint beliefs. They're complex psychological coping mechanisms against the ever-present dangers. You hear stories participate in rituals blessing doorways before passing through them, avoiding certain staircases during storms, carrying charms believed to ward off poison or falling stones. These provide a fragile, self-made illusion of control in a world where genuine control is almost non-existent. You cling to them, perhaps not because you truly believe they will prevent disaster, but because they offer a small comforting ritual, a sense of agency in the face of overwhelming randomness. It's a way of imposing order on a chaotic, dangerous world, a quiet, desperate hope whispered into the stone. One of the most profound and perhaps chilling adaptations you witness is a peculiar desensitization to brutality. The constant presence of death, public executions in the courtyard, the whispers of torture in the dungeons, the casual violence of everyday life leads to a unique detachment from suffering. This isn't necessarily a choice. It's a necessary survival mechanism. If you allowed yourself to feel the full weight of every cruelty, every injustice, every brutal act, you would quickly crumble. So you develop a protective shell. You learn to observe without fully feeling, to process without fully internalizing. This emotional deadening, while vital for self-preservation, comes at a cost, a subtle but undeniable loss of connection to basic humanity. You see a man being led to the gallows, and while a part of you might flinch, another part observes with a detached curiosity, almost as if watching a play. It's a grim transformation, a quiet sacrifice of your own empathy in the name of survival. Amidst all this peril, you discover that cultural disciplines perhaps surprisingly serve as vital outlets. While not explicitly a death trap, the strict rules and demands for self-control found in practices like the tea ceremony, though more specific to Japanese feudalism, the concept of such rigid ritualized practices fits here. Calligraphy or poetry offered a means of imposing order on a chaotic, dangerous world. Even in European castles there were equivalent rigid codes of chivalry, courtly etiquette, precise forms of dance, or intricate rules for falconry. These weren't just pastimes. They were escapes focusing the mind, demanding discipline, and allowing for a moment of controlled beauty in an otherwise unpredictable existence. They reflect a deep-seated human need for control, for structure, for a moment of quiet discipline, when everything else feels like it's spiraling into chaos. You might find yourself practicing a precise bow, or listening intently to a bard's carefully constructed verse, finding a strange, quiet comfort in the perfection of the form, a brief respite from the harsh realities outside the parlour door. The spiritual frameworks of the time, rather than providing unadulterated solace, often added another layer of psychological oppression. Imagine the castle chapels. They are often stark, cold places adorned with grim depictions of hell damnation and the torments of the damned. These images serve as constant visceral reminders of mortality and divine judgment. You sit in the cold stone pews listening to sermons that emphasize suffering, the brevity of earthly life, and the omnipresent threat of eternal damnation. This creates a pervasive atmosphere of guilt and fear within the fortress, reinforcing the idea that this life is merely a trial, and suffering is to be expected. You look at the tormented figures in the frescoes, and a sense of dread settles over you. Mandatory daily chapel services, while theoretically intended to provide comfort and spiritual guidance, often compounded the despair for already struggling inhabitants. The focus on harsh spiritual realities, the constant admonition of sin, and the grim tales of saints who endured unimaginable suffering left many feeling hopeless and without true solace. Instead of finding peace, you might emerge from the chapel feeling heavier, burdened by the weight of your own perceived sinfulness and the inescapable suffering of the world. It's a stark contrast to the modern idea of religion as a source of comfort. Here it often felt like another instrument of psychological control, another grim reminder of your precarious place in a terrifying universe. Adding to this spiritual pressure, the castle confessors wielded immense psychological power. Imagine a clergyman cloistered within the castle walls who knows everyone's secrets, everyone's fears, every transgression whispered in the dark confines of the confessional. Their ability to absolve or condemn, to grant spiritual peace or withhold it, was profound. And often these confessors were deeply involved in castle politics, serving as advisors to the Lord, privy to intrigues and rivalries. This dual role added another layer of profound psychological stress for you, the inhabitant. Your deepest thoughts, your most private fears, your secret desires, all were vulnerable, shared with a figure who held not just spiritual authority, but often secular influence too. You might find yourself carefully crafting your confessions, editing your sins, acutely aware that your spiritual guide could also be a political informant. It's a subtle but constant pressure, knowing that even your inner world is not entirely your own, and that the words you utter in an act of contrition could in another context be used against you. And now consider the intimate sphere of love, marriage, and family life within these stone confines, and how even these fundamental human connections were twisted into another form of trap. marriage, especially among the nobility, was almost exclusively a pragmatic political and economic alliance. Forget romantic notions of love and devotion. Here a marriage was a treaty, a land deal, a consolidation of power. There was little room for romantic love, which was often relegated to the realm of courtly fiction, or dismissed as a dangerous weakness, a frivolous distraction from the serious business of power and survival. You might witness arranged marriages devoid of affection, where two people are bound together not by choice, but by obligation, their lives a cold, calculated transaction. The absence of genuine emotional connection creates an emotional desert, a profound loneliness even in companionship. For noble women, this reality was particularly stark. Frequently married, oft to secure alliances, often to much older men they barely knew, they found themselves imprisoned in stone coffins. Separated from their own families, sent to live in a strange, often hostile castle, they were viewed primarily as assets tools in a dynastic game. This often led to chronic anxiety and severe depression, a condition sometimes vaguely referred to as melancholy. You might observe them pale and withdrawn, retreating into fantasy, losing themselves in the elaborate worlds of illuminated manuscripts, or finding solace in intense religious obsession as a coping mechanism. Their lives, intended to secure a lineage, became a quiet form of emotional incarceration, their spirits slowly dying within the very walls that represented their family's ascendants. It's a subtle, agonizing form of death far from the battlefield. The constant stress, pervasive paranoia, and rigid social structures within castle walls fostered profoundly dysfunctional family patterns. Imagine children growing up in an environment where emotional expression is stifled, where distrust is ingrained, and where power dynamics often supersede familial affection. This perpetuated cycles of violence, distrust, and emotional detachment across generations. A father's harshness, born from the pressures of his own existence, is passed down to a son who in turn perpetuates it. The castle, designed to preserve family power and legacy, ironically became a crucible for dysfunctional dynamics, effectively poisoning family life from within. You might see the strained interactions, the cold silences, the quick flashes of anger, and understand that the very structures meant to protect the family were in a deeper sense destroying it from the inside out. The weight of clan identity, or either more pronounced in Japanese contexts, the underlying principle of collective identity, holds true for European feudalism, exerted an immense pressure. Your individual identity was largely subsumed by the collective. Your personal actions had far-reaching consequences impacting not just yourself, but the entire lineage's reputation, social standing, and material wealth. Imagine the pressure every choice you make, every word you utter, carries the potential to uplift or utterly disgrace your family name. This created immense pressure to conform, to sacrifice personal desires for the good of the collective. There was little room for individualism, for forging your own path. Your life was not your own. It was a thread in the vast tapestry of your family's history, and you were expected to behave accordingly. This constant scrutiny, this demand for unwavering loyalty to the family unit regardless of personal cost, was yet another layer of psychological confinement. The accumulated psychological damage endured within castle walls, you begin to grasp, poisoned everyone it touched. For those who managed to escape the physical confines of the castle, perhaps through marriage or service elsewhere, the mental scars remained. They often carried long-term issues, hypervigilance, a constant state of alertness born from years of living in danger, an inability to trust, a deep-seated suspicion of others, fostered by pervasive paranoia, and profound difficulties forming healthy open relationships as genuine emotional connection had been suppressed for so long. The castle, even after you leave it, continues to exert its influence, shaping your perception of the world, making true peace and comfort elusive. You see it in the haunted eyes of those who have left, the way they flinch at loud noises, the way they hold themselves apart even in seemingly safe environments. The death trap, you realize, was not just physical, but also profoundly psychological, leaving invisible wounds that never truly healed. and often these psychological scars were passed down through generations within noble families. The patterns of paranoia, the emotional distance, the rigid control, these traits became ingrained, shaping bloodlines, with persistent, often destructive patterns of behaviour. The very structures designed to preserve family power, ironically, often destroyed the families themselves, creating a legacy of emotional dysfunction that outlived the stone and mortar. You might observe a lord's suspicious nature mirrored in his son, or a lady's quiet melancholy appearing in her daughter, a chilling inheritance passed down through the centuries, ensuring that the castle's influence lived on, even in those born long after its initial construction. The castle in its essence became a factory for broken spirits, perpetuating its own unique form of silent suffering across the generations. Ultimately, you realise the absolute power wielded within these fortresses combined with their inherent dangers shaped a brutal reality. Every decision made by the Lord, every person who resided within the walls, and indeed every dark corner of the castle itself held the potential for death. It transformed these symbols of might not just into fortresses, but into instruments of human suffering. And this brings you to the final chilling aspect of the castle. As a death trap, the mechanisms of power and control enforced within its walls, and how even the mental state of the ruling lord could lead to ruin and death, making survival a complex navigation of both physical and societal threats. The unyielding power hierarchy, while seemingly stable, presented its own subtle forms of peril. The castle lord, despite holding what appeared to be absolute power within his domain, lived in a constant gnawing state of fear. Imagine the weight on his shoulders, the fear of assassination from ambitious rivals, the threat of internal revolt from disgruntled retainers or starved peasants, or the ever-present spectre of an external siege which could mean the end of his lineage and everything he holds dear. This created a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion that dictated his every behaviour and impacted everyone in the fortress. You as an inhabitant would feel this tension emanating from the top, a silent hum of paranoia that trickled down through every rank. Your lord's anxieties became in a way your anxiety, shaping the very air you breathed within the castle walls. This profound anxiety often manifested in bizarre and dangerous behaviours in the lords themselves. You might hear whispers or even witness firsthand a lord demanding multiple food tasters before he would take a single bite, a ritual born of the fear of poison. Or perhaps he would sleep in a different room each night, a frantic effort to avoid predictable patterns that an assassin might exploit. In more extreme cases, the constant pressure and isolation could lead to a lord descending into madness, ordering irrational acts like the slaughter of birds believed to be spies, or the imprisonment of loyal servants on a whim. These erratic decisions, born from a mind under immense strain, could have devastating consequences for everyone within the castle. You learn to walk on eggshells, to read the subtle shifts in your lord's mood, to anticipate his unpredictable temper, knowing that your life and the lives of those around you could hinge on his next irrational command. The demand for unquestioning obedience cascaded down the hierarchy, reinforcing the lord's ultimate authority. From the highest knight to the lowliest kitchen hand, every individual was expected to obey without hesitation, without question. Any perceived insolence, any hint of weakness, or even a well-intentioned attempt to help a psychologically distressed lord could be interpreted as treason. Imagine seeing a loyal retainer attempting to reason with a paranoid lord only to be accused of insubordination and dragged off to the dungeons. The consequences were brutal, often leading to severe punishment, torture, or even death. You learn the cold lesson that silence and absolute deference are often the safest paths, that expressing an opinion, even a helpful one, could be a fatal error. The castle, in its rigid power structure, was designed to crush dissent, and you as a part of it were constantly reminded of this unforgiving reality. These castle lords, driven mad by the stresses of fortress life, and the absolute power they wielded, often made increasingly erratic and dangerous decisions regarding military campaigns or grandiose building projects. A lord consumed by paranoia might launch a reckless attack on a neighbour, draining the castle's resources and risking the lives of his garrison. Another, obsessed with displaying his might embark on a colossal, unsustainable building project, pushing his people to the brink of starvation and ruin. These decisions, born from a fractured mind, could lead directly to the destruction of their domains and the death of their people. The castle, you realize, served as a stark amplifier for human folly, transforming a solitary ruler's deteriorating mind into a widespread catastrophe for all within its reach. You begin to understand the profound psychological vulnerability that comes with power, especially power contained within the walls of a castle. The Lord, despite his apparent might, lives with the knowledge that his survival and that of his lineage depends entirely on the strength of stone and mortar. He understands, perhaps more acutely than anyone, that even the most impregnable fortress could eventually be breached through treachery, through starvation, or through sheer overwhelming force. This creates a persistent colouring anxiety that pervades his existence, translating into his rigid behaviour, his suspicion, his ruthlessness. You might observe the Lord in a moment of quiet contemplation, his eyes distant, and realise that beneath the layers of authority and privilege, he too is a prisoner trapped by the weight of his responsibilities and the ever-present threat of ultimate failure. This anxiety, this deep-seated fear of losing everything, is a death trap for the soul, even for those at the very pinnacle of the hierarchy. Within the castle walls, the legal and enforcement mechanisms were equally arbitrary and brutal, adding another layer of existential threat to your daily life. Justice, if you could call it that, was often immediate and arbitrary, resting largely on the whim and will of your immediate superior, whether that was the Lord himself, his seneschal, or even a higher-ranking knight. There was little to no concept of individual rights for commoners, no standardized legal processes, no presumption of innocence as you might understand it. A simple mistake, a perceived slight regardless of your true intent, could result in severe, often fatal consequences. You learn that your best defense is invisibility, to never draw attention, to blend into the background. The rule of law here is personal, not universal, and its application is swift and unforgiving. Punishments, you quickly learn, were often public and brutally effective, serving as stark deterrents against dissent or transgression. Imagine a gallows in the central courtyard, or the public display of a captured criminal in the stocks. These spectacles were designed to reinforce the absolute power of the Lord and the terrifying fragility of individual life within the castle's jurisdiction. You're forced to witness these grim events, perhaps as a stark reminder of what could happen to you if you stepped out of line, if you dared to challenge the established order. The screams, the pleas, the silent despair, all etched into your memory, shaping your understanding of acceptable behaviour. It's not just punishment, it's a performance, a chilling demonstration of unquestionable authority. And the justice system often relied on confession, which horrifyingly could be extracted through torture. You hear the whispers of the dungeon, the chilling accounts of those who entered and emerged broken or did not emerge at all. This highlights the complete absence of individual rights, the terrifying reality that your word, your innocence, meant little against the will of your interrogator and the instruments of pain. The harsh realities of legal enforcement under the Lord's direct and often unchallengeable authority meant that simply being accused rather than being proven guilty was often enough to seal your fate. You learn to fear not just the external enemy, but the internal mechanisms of control, the power that could strip you of your dignity, your truth, and ultimately your life, all within the very walls meant to be your sanctuary. It's a terrifying thought that the place designed to keep you safe could also be the place where your most profound suffering occurs. Beyond the physical and psychological pressures, you also begin to perceive the shadow of death, cast by economic control, or rather the relentless economic anxiety that drove so much of castle life. The enormous costs of building and maintaining a castle, feeding armies during times of peace and war, Supplying garrisons, projecting power through grand structures and retinues meant that even the wealthiest nobles lived on the precipice of financial disaster. You might overhear hushed conversations about dwindling coffers, about the need to raise taxes, about the growing debts owed to merchants or moneylenders. This creates a constant low-level fear of bankruptcy, and you understand its devastating consequences for power status and life itself. For a lord, losing his castle due to debt meant losing everything: his lands, his title, his influence, and quite possibly his life or the lives of his family. For you, his subject, it meant potential displacement, starvation, or falling under the harsher rule of a new, perhaps more ruthless lord. The castle, you realize, is an insatiable maw constantly devouring resources, and if it is not fed, it will consume its inhabitants. This pervasive economic anxiety often led lords to desperate, reckless behaviours. Imagine a lord, his family's fortunes dwindling, mortgaging, his children's futures perhaps selling off valuable lands or heirlooms that had been in the family for generations. Or he might embark on risky ventures for quick wealth, perhaps a daring raid on a neighbouring territory, or a speculative investment in trade that could easily go awry. These desperate measures frequently resulted in a downward spiral of debt and desperation that culminated in ruin. You might witness a once proud family fall into penury, their castle stripped bare, their retainers dispersed, their lineage brought to an ignominious end. It's a testament to how the relentless economic pressure driven by the very existence of the castle could become a death trap, not through a sudden blow, but through a slow, agonizing bleed. The pursuit of power and status inextricably linked to the castle often demanded everything and more. And in this brutal world, death itself was intrinsically interwoven with the concept of honor and state control. While the practice of seppuku ritual suicide is more distinctly associated with later Japanese feudalism, the underlying concept of death for honor or atonement fits the general control paradigm of medieval Europe. For a knight, facing disgrace might mean a choice between death in battle or public humiliation. For a lord, defending his honor even against impossible odds was paramount, often leading to his demise. Execution, of course, was the ultimate punishment for transgression, a stark reinforcement of the lord's power. Imagine a thief caught stealing food from the castle stores, or a deserter from the garrison. Their death was not just a punishment for their actions, but a public spectacle, a tool of state power designed to instill fear and maintain order. You understand that your life, your very existence, is subject to the Lord's will, and that death, whether by his command or by your own choice for honour, is an ever-present spectre, a final, absolute means of control. Ultimately, the most profound and terrifying cost of living within these fortified death traps was the pervasive, profound awareness that survival was tenuous. Despite the towering stone walls, despite the formidable defences, death stalked the innocent through means both subtle and sudden. It was not just an external enemy at the gates, but a constant internal threat woven into the very fabric of daily life. You understood that even in the safest moments during a quiet meal, or in the stillness of your sleep, death could find you. It could be the silent creep of disease, the sudden collapse of a beam, the contamination in your drinking water, or the irrational command of a paranoid lord. The castle in its silence tells a story not just of power, but of suffering, a testament to the daily grinding struggle for existence in a world both magnificent and terrifyingly lethal. You understand that the castle, for all its might, was a place where life was cheap, and where even the most mundane aspects of existence were imbued with a quiet, insidious danger. It truly was a constant internal threat, not merely a fortress against the world, but a crucible for human suffering. And as you consider this chilling truth, your mind might drift to other, perhaps geographically distant historical parallels, where warriors fell from grace, becoming discarded figures, revealing another facet of instability born from rigid power structures. While the term ronin is specific to Japan, conceptually medieval European castles also produced figures who fell from grace or lost their purpose, leading to profound struggle and social ostracism. Imagine the landless knight, perhaps, whose lord has died without an heir or whose fiefdom has been lost in battle. Or the disenfranchised soldier whose garrison has been disbanded, leaving him without a lord, without land, without a purpose. These figures, much like the ronin, found themselves adrift in a rigid feudal society where status and survival were inextricably linked to a lord and land. They became sources of instability, wandering the countryside, often turning to banditry or desperately seeking a new master. You might encounter such a figure, perhaps a man with weary eyes and a haunted look, and understand that his misfortune, his discarded status, is a direct consequence of the very system the castle represents. His existence underscores the fragility of life and status, even for those once considered noble or honourable. The harsh conditions and oppressive systems enforced within castles were often the root causes of widespread suffering and unrest, not just for the lord, but for the populace that supported him, and even for the castle staff itself. Think of excessive taxes levied to support the lord's wars, or his lavish lifestyle grinding the peasants into poverty, or corrupt officials enriching themselves at the expense of the common folk, sparking simmering resentment. Or perhaps the most immediate and terrifying food shortages leading to widespread hunger and desperation. These issues created inherent instability, a volatile environment ripe for discontent. You might witness the desperate faces of peasants bringing their meagre tribute to their eyes, holding a quiet defiance, or hear whispers of discontent among the castle servants themselves, tired of the poor rations and harsh treatment. The castle, you realise, was not always a beacon of stability, but often a powder keg of resentment waiting for a spark. And any form of dissent, whether overt rebellion or subtle insubordination within the castle walls, faced severe, often lethal consequences. Imagine a servant caught speaking ill of the lord, or a soldier questioning a command. Their punishment would be swift and brutal, serving as a stark reminder of the lord's absolute authority and the terrifying dangers of challenging the established order in a fortress designed to kill. The dungeons, the gallows, the public floggings all served to maintain an iron grip of control, crushing any spark of rebellion before it could ignite. You learn to keep your head down, to nod in agreement, to never speak your true mind if it differs from the established narrative. The castle in its very essence was a place that valued unquestioning obedience above all else, and your survival depended on adhering to that grim reality. In conclusion, you begin to see medieval castles as far more than just military strongholds. They were intricate and brutal death traps that inadvertently claimed countless lives through their very design, their environmental realities, and the relentless psychological tolls they exacted. They stand as stark, unromanticized monuments to a time when survival, even within the supposed sanctuary of stone, demanded an extraordinary and often tragic price. You can almost hear the stones themselves whispering stories of hardship, illness, and despair, a grim counterpoint to the glorious tales often told. The castle in its silence tells a story not just of power, but of suffering, a testament to the daily grinding struggle for existence in a world both magnificent and terrifyingly lethal. As the historical landscape settles around you, you might reflect on the subtle ways in which the castle amplified human vulnerability. It wasn't just the overt threats of war or pestilence, but the ceaseless quiet erosion of well-being that truly defined life within its walls. Consider the daily grind, the pervasive chill that never truly left your bones regardless of the season, creating an almost constant state of mild hypothermia. You might remember the ache in your joints, the persistent shiver, and the way your fingers felt clumsy, perpetually numb. This constant cold was a silent aggressor, weakening your immune system, making you more susceptible to the myriad diseases that festered in the damp, poorly ventilated environment. You'd find yourself dreaming of warmth, a luxury that felt as unattainable as a king's ransom. Then there was the air heavy and stagnant, a cocktail of smoke-unwashed bodies, and the indescribable tang of human and animal waste. Every breath you took, you were inhaling the very essence of the castle's unsanitary reality. This wasn't merely an unpleasant smell. It was a constant assault on your respiratory system, contributing to chronic coughs, persistent lung ailments, and making you more vulnerable to infections that thrived in such conditions. You might attempt to tie a piece of cloth over your nose and mouth, a futile gesture against the invisible particles that filled every corner of your living space. The air itself became a slow poison, a constant reminder of the castle's true nature as a confined, unhygienic prison. And the darkness. Oh, the darkness. The narrow arrow slits that provided defensive advantage also plunged most of the castle into perpetual gloom. You'd spend your days in a world of muted light, relying on the flickering smoky glow of crude oil lamps and torches. This lack of natural light affected your vision, straining your eyes, but it also impacted your mood, contributing to the pervasive sense of melancholy and despair. You might find yourself longing for the simple, unadulterated brightness of the sun, a luxury that the castle in its defensive posture denied you. The shadows, deep and unyielding, became a part of your daily reality, concealing dangers, fostering paranoia, and slowly, subtly eroding your spirit. Even the sounds of the castle, which might seem comforting in their familiarity, contributed to the pervasive anxiety. The creak of old timbers, the groan of shifting stone, the distant echoes of voices or footsteps, these sounds, magnified by the stone walls, created a constant acoustic landscape that offered little peace. There was no true quiet, no moments of solitary tranquility. You were always aware of the castle, always aware of its presence, always listening, always on edge. It was a subtle form of sensory overload, preventing your mind from ever truly resting constantly, keeping you tethered to the harsh realities of your environment. You'd find yourself flinching at sudden noises, your body perpetually braced for the unexpected, a silent testament to the psychological toll. The constant threat of structural failure, though often unspoken, was a pervasive undercurrent of anxiety. You learned to listen to the castle, to the subtle groans and shifts, the way the wind whistles through newly formed cracks in the masonry. Every creak of a floorboard above you, every faint rumble in the stone could be the precursor to a sudden, devastating collapse. You imagine the architects, perhaps brilliant in their day, wrestling with imperfect materials and rudimentary engineering knowledge. Their solutions, while impressive for their time, were often inherently flawed, built with green timber that warped and split and mortar that succumbed to the relentless freeze-thaw cycles. You might find yourself subconsciously eyeing the massive beams overhead in the Great Hall, wondering how many more years they could possibly bear the immense weight above them. It's a quiet dread, a constant low-level hum of uncertainty, knowing that the very roof over your head, the walls that shield you, could also become your tomb without a moment's notice. Consider the human element in this architectural lottery. The builders, the masons, the labourers who painstakingly erected these colossal structures were themselves often working in incredibly dangerous conditions. You can almost feel the cold sweat on their brows as they hoisted massive stones into place hundreds of feet above the ground, with only rudimentary scaffolding and ropes. Imagine the sheer muscle, the precarious balance, the constant risk of a slip, a dropped tool, a sudden gust of wind. The number of accidents during construction, the lives lost in the very act of building the castle, would have been staggering. And these accidents, these inherent dangers in the construction process, left their mark on the finished product. A slightly off-kilter arch, a section of wall built with less than ideal stone, a beam that wasn't quite straight. These imperfections, born from human error and the unforgiving nature of the task, became the systemic vulnerabilities you now live with, quietly waiting to fail to take another life. The castle's defences, designed with such lethal precision against attackers, ironically demanded a constant, grueling maintenance that often put the inhabitants themselves at risk. Imagine the guards on patrol during a storm navigating icy, wind-battered battlements with sheer drops on either side, their hands numb with cold, their eyes straining through the driving rain or snow. Or consider the work required to keep the drawbridges and portcullises operational. These massive heavy mechanisms constantly battling rust rot in the elements. A chain could snap a winch, could jam, sending heavy timbers or iron gates plummeting down. You see the calloused hands of the engineers, the grim determination on their faces as they perform these dangerous tasks, knowing that a single mistake could mean a crushed limb or a fatal fall. The very acts that ensure the castle's defence are themselves a constant source of peril for those who maintain them. And then there's the internal geography of the castle, a labyrinth designed to confuse and trap. The winding spiral staircases, often lacking central newel posts, were not merely architectural quirks. They were deliberate design choices often built clockwise to disadvantage a right-handed attacker, ascending with a sword forcing them to expose their unshielded side. But for you, the resident, navigating these steep, dark and often uneven stairs day in and day out, perhaps carrying heavy loads, they were a constant hazard. You imagine the countless stumbles, the bruised shins, the twisted ankles, the fatal falls in the perpetual gloom. Every journey from one level to another became a quiet test of agility and vigilance. You learn to feel for the step with your foot, before committing your weight to rely on muscle memory in the pitch black, a constant unconscious dance with gravity. Beyond the stairs, the narrow passages and concealed turns within the castle were not just quaint features, they were tactical elements designed to funnel and bottleneck attackers, creating ideal ambush points. But for you, the inhabitant navigating these spaces daily, they created a perpetual sense of claustrophobia and unease. Imagine moving through corridors where you could barely pass another person, the thick stone walls pressing in the air, feeling heavy and trapped. These tight spaces, combined with the dim lighting, often meant you were in constant danger of collisions or of being caught unaware. The castle's protective design, in its focus on control and containment, inadvertently created an environment that felt less like a home and more like a maze from which escape, even during times of peace, felt perpetually elusive. The constant need for vigilance against external threats also bled into daily life, transforming innocuous spaces into zones of potential danger. Consider the battlements, those fortified parapets atop the walls. They offered panoramic views of the surrounding landscape, crucial for spotting approaching enemies. But these were exposed, windswept and often slippery places with precipitous drops on the outer side. For guards on watch, especially during harsh weather, falling was a real and terrifying possibility. You might imagine the bitter wind tearing at your cloak, the driving rain making the stone treacherous underfoot as you peer into the darkness, not just for invaders, but for a solid foothold. The very act of protecting the castle from outside forces put its protectors in constant immediate peril. And the castle's very construction often included hidden or secret passages designed for escape or surprise attacks during a siege. While potentially life-saving for the lord or his inner circle for the common inhabitants, these passages could be incredibly dangerous. Imagine poorly maintained unlit tunnels prone to collapse, filled with stagnant air and perhaps even vermin. If you were ever forced to use one in an emergency, the risk of getting lost, trapped or succumbing to lack of oxygen or poisonous fumes would be immense. These hidden features, while adding to the mystique of the castle, were yet another reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface, transforming seemingly benign architectural elements into potential death traps for the unwary. Even the materials used for building beyond their structural flaws could pose hidden health risks. Certain types of stone, for example, might have contained naturally occurring heavy metals or minerals that over centuries could leach into the environment, affecting the water table or the quality of the air. While this wouldn't have been understood at the time, the long-term exposure to these subtle environmental contaminants could have contributed to chronic illnesses among the castle population. You wouldn't see it or taste it explicitly, but a low-level pervasive toxicity could be slowly grinding away at the health of the inhabitants, an invisible enemy hidden within the very fabric of their home. It's a testament to the myriad, often unacknowledged ways that the castle could exact its silent toll. And the constant dampness, beyond merely fostering mould and decay, also created a breeding ground for various fungal and bacterial infections that thrived in the cool, moist environment. Imagine skin rashes, persistent coughs, eye infections, all exacerbated by the pervasive humidity and lack of sunlight. These weren't necessarily fatal on their own, but they contributed to a chronic state of ill health, weakening the inhabitants and making them more susceptible to the truly lethal diseases that swept through the castle. It was a slow, grinding attrition, a constant battle against environmental factors that wore down the body and spirit, making life an unending exercise in resilience against unseen microbial attackers. You might also consider the grim reality of sanitation in times of siege, when the castle became an utterly self-contained closed system. With no ability to empty latrines or dispose of waste beyond the walls, the problem you've already observed with basic guardrobes becomes catastrophic. Imagine human waste refuse and animal carcasses accumulating within the inner bailey, festering in the open air, attracting swarms of flies and rats. The stench would be unbearable, a thick, putrid miasma that clung to everything. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a guaranteed catalyst for epidemic. Diseases would spread like wildfire through the besieged population, turning the castle into a death trap, far more effective than any enemy weapon. You'd witness the grim toll, the rapid decline of once healthy individuals, as the very effort to survive the siege inadvertently creates an internal biohazard. The mental impact of prolonged siege conditions also cannot be overstated. Beyond the physical privations, the psychological toll of being trapped, knowing that every day brings you closer to starvation or breakthrough, is immense. The constant anxiety of attack, the rationing of food and water, the sight of your comrades falling ill or succumbing to wounds without proper care, all combine to create a crucible of despair. Paranoia would run rampant, suspicion festering among the trapped inhabitants. You might see men and women pushed to their breaking point, their minds fracturing under the relentless pressure leading to irrational acts, violent outbursts, or simply a quiet, hopeless surrender. The castle in its defensive strength inadvertently became a pressure cooker, turning the minds of its inhabitants against themselves. Think too of the psychological impact of living in a hierarchy where your fate is entirely in the hands of another. As a common soldier or servant, your life is utterly expendable to the Lord. You're a tool, a resource to be used and discarded as needed. This profound lack of agency, the understanding that your life holds little individual value beyond your utility to the castle, grinds away at your sense of self-worth. You might find yourself performing dangerous duties, knowing that if you fall, another will simply take your place, and your absence will barely be noted. This constant devaluation of human life, born from the rigid feudal structure and the military imperative, is a subtle yet powerful psychological death trap, slowly stripping away your dignity and sense of purpose. Even the concept of honour, so central to medieval life, could be a veiled form of death trap, particularly for the nobility. A lord or knight might feel compelled by honour to engage in a reckless battle, to uphold a foolish vow, or to defend a lost cause, knowing it will lead to his certain demise. The social pressure to maintain one's reputation to avoid shame could drive individuals to embrace death as a preferable alternative to dishonour. You might see a knight facing a hopeless situation choosing to charge headlong into enemy lines, rather than retreat, sacrificing his life for an abstract concept. This highlights how deeply ingrained societal expectations, combined with the brutal realities of warfare and power, could lead individuals to willingly enter a death trap driven by forces far beyond their control. The very success of a castle, its ability to withstand numerous sieges, or to project immense power could lead to a dangerous complacency or hubris in its lord. A lord who believes his castle impregnable might neglect its maintenance, allow its garrison to dwindle or underestimate a new, more formidable enemy. This overconfidence born from past victories could set the stage for a catastrophic downfall. You might see signs of this: crumbling walls, ignored unpatched roofs, lax training among the soldiers, and feel a quiet dread as the castle, once a symbol of strength, begins to show signs of its own decay from within an inevitable decline fostered by arrogance. The castle's role as a fixed point in a dynamic and ever-evolving world also presented a peculiar form of obsolescence, which in its own way became a death trap. As siege technology advanced with the development of more powerful trebuchets, larger siege engines and eventually gunpowder artillery, the once impregnable stone walls became increasingly vulnerable. A castle built in the 12th century state-of-the-art for its time might be rendered obsolete by the 15th century, unable to withstand the new destructive forces. Imagine residing in a castle, feeling secure in its ancient strength, only for a new terrifying weapon to arrive on the horizon capable of reducing your stone sanctuary to rubble. This technological arms race meant that a castle that failed to adapt to be constantly upgraded and reinforced was a ticking time bomb, a death trap waiting for the next great innovation in warfare. You would witness the changing landscape of battle, perhaps hear the distant roar of a cannon for the first time, and understand that the very definition of safe was rapidly shifting beneath your feet, rendering your stone home vulnerable in ways never before imagined. Even the process of simply living in a feudal society bound by intricate and often opaque rules of inheritance and succession created its own lethal ambiguities within the castle. The death of a lord, particularly without a clear or undisputed heir, could plunge the entire castle and its surrounding lands into chaos. Rival claimants might emerge, leading to internal power struggles, assassinations, or even petty sieges from within the family itself, turning the castle into a battleground between factions. You might find yourself caught in the middle of these intrigues, forced to choose sides, knowing that the wrong choice could mean torture, imprisonment, or death. The very mechanisms designed to ensure continuity of power often became the catalyst for violent disruption, making succession a deadly gamble for everyone involved, a macabre Game of Thrones played out within the very walls that housed them. The isolation that defined castle life also exacerbated the psychological toll by limiting exposure to new ideas or outside perspectives. Imagine living in a closed system where news from the outside world arrived sporadically and was often filtered through the Lord's biases. This intellectual confinement, combined with the lack of mental stimulation, could contribute to a form of stagnation, a quiet despair for those with inquiring minds. You might find yourself craving new stories, new knowledge, anything to break the monotony and the oppressive familiarity of your stone prison. This intellectual death trap, subtle as it was, slowly withered the spirit, leaving minds less agile, less capable of coping with the demands of an unpredictable existence. And in a world where disease was poorly understood, the castle itself could inadvertently become a centre for the spread of zoonotic diseases, illnesses transmitted from animals to humans. With livestock often housed within the outer bailey or in close proximity to human dwellings, and with the constant presence of rats, fleas and other vermin, the risk of pathogens jumping species was ever present. You might see a cow sicken or a herd of pigs become diseased, and soon after members of the human population begin to fall ill with strange unfamiliar symptoms. The close quarters, the lack of veterinary medicine, and the poor sanitation combined to create a perfect storm for these deadly transfers. The very animals that sustain the castle could without warning become the vectors of its inhabitants' demise, an invisible threat lurking in the very source of their sustenance. The dependence on specific agricultural cycles for sustenance created an inherent vulnerability that could quickly turn into a death trap for the castle's population. Imagine a single, bad harvest, perhaps due to an unseasonable frost, a prolonged drought, or a blight spreading through the fields. In a feudal system where the castle's stores were built primarily on tithes from the surrounding land, this meant immediate and widespread scarcity. The concept of importing food from distant, unaffected regions was often impractical or impossible due to cost logistics or ongoing conflicts. You would witness the slow, agonizing onset of famine, the dwindling rations, the gaunt faces of children. The castle, for all its defensive might, could not protect its inhabitants from the most fundamental threat, starvation. The lack of diversity in their food sources and the fragility of medieval agriculture meant that the very basis of their survival was a constant gamble, with nature's unpredictable whims leading to a quiet, insidious form of demise for many. Even the aesthetic choices within the castle could surprisingly contribute to its danger. Imagine elaborate tapestries adorning the great halls, beautiful and impressive, depicting grand historical scenes or intricate narratives. While seemingly innocuous, these large heavy hangings, often made of wool or other flammable materials, were significant fire hazards. A stray spark from a hearth and overturned lamp, and these tapestries could ignite with terrifying speed, spreading flames through vast rooms, cutting off escape routes and turning the air toxic with smoke. They also harboured dust vermin and could trap moisture, contributing to the overall unhealthy atmosphere. You might admire the artistry, but also sense the hidden danger they represented, a beautiful object that could in an instant become an instrument of your fiery end. The rigid social structure of the castle also fostered an environment where medical knowledge and innovation stagnated. Imagine a society where knowledge was often closely guarded within guilds or monasteries, and where commoners had little access to even rudimentary medical care. The prevailing medical theories, often based on ancient Greek ideas of humours and imbalances, were largely ineffective, and as you've seen, could be actively harmful. There was little incentive for research or improvement, as the lives of common folk were often deemed less valuable, and the nobility often had access to the best, albeit still primitive care available. This meant that the castle, for all its might, was a place where progress in saving lives was slow to non-existent, making it a death trap for anyone who fell ill with anything more serious than a common cold. You would watch helpless as simple ailments escalated into fatal conditions, knowing that elsewhere in another time perhaps there might have been a cure. Furthermore, the castle's reliance on human and animal power for all tasks from grinding grain to hauling water meant a constant exposure to physical strain and injury. Imagine the labourers, their bodies aching from dawn till dusk, constantly lifting, pulling, pushing heavy loads. The risks of sprains, broken bones, herniated discs and chronic joint pain were immense. Without proper understanding of ergonomics or preventative care, these injuries would accumulate, leading to early debilitation and a reduced quality of life. A simple strained back could mean you could no longer perform your duties, leading to destitution and expulsion from the castle walls, a slow death sentence through neglect. The very engine of the castle's functionality was also the source of quiet, constant physical suffering for those who powered it. And the mental strains extended to the constant fear of arbitrary punishment for perceived slights, not just major transgressions. Imagine a servant being beaten for breaking a plate, or a soldier for being slightly late to duty. These acts of casual cruelty, while not always fatal, immediately chipped away at the spirit, fostering a pervasive fear that shaped every interaction. You learn to be perpetually cautious, to anticipate every possible mistake, to live in a constant state of low-level anxiety. This environment, where personal autonomy was virtually non-existent, and your body was subject to the whims of your superiors, created a profound sense of powerlessness. It was a slow, grinding death of self, leaving you with little inner life beyond the struggle for basic survival. The very act of resource allocation during times of scarcity further highlighted the castle as a death trap for the common inhabitant. When food and water dwindled during a siege or after a poor harvest, the existing hierarchy dictated who received what. The lord and his immediate family would naturally receive the lion's share, ensuring their survival. The knights and key soldiers would receive enough to maintain their fighting strength. But for the servants, the lower-ranking soldiers, the peasants sheltering within the walls, rations would be severely cut, often to starvation levels. You would witness this stark reality first-hand the Lord's table, though perhaps less lavish than in peacetime, still bearing sustenance, while you gnawed on a crust of mouldy bread, your stomach cramping with hunger. This deliberate hierarchical starvation, driven by the cold logic of military necessity, turned the castle into a triage centre for death, where those deemed less valuable were quietly systematically sacrificed. Moreover, the castle, by its very nature as a self-contained power centre, often attracted undesirable elements. Beyond the noble family and their loyal retainers, you might find opportunistic individuals, schemers, and ambitious rivals drawn to the Lord's court seeking influence or gain. These internal factions could lead to backstabbing, poisoning, and quiet assassinations, turning the castle into a viper's nest of political intrigue. You might hear whispers of a rival noble being found dead in his bed, or a servant vanishing without a trace, and understand that the dangers within the castle were not always external. The constant manoeuvring for power, the subtle feuds, and the ruthless elimination of rivals meant that even those in positions of relative comfort were never truly safe. The walls that kept out invaders could not keep out the insidious poisons of human ambition and treachery. The sheer isolation of castle life also magnified the impact of mental illness. In a pre-modern world, mental health was poorly understood, often attributed to demonic possession or moral failing. Imagine an individual suffering from severe depression, anxiety, or psychosis within the confines of a castle, far from any specialized care or even basic understanding. They might be chained, locked away in a cell, or simply left to waste away their suffering, prolonged and exacerbated by the lack of compassion or effective treatment. For their family members, it would be a heartbreaking, helpless situation, further adding to the psychological burden of castle life. The castle in its isolation thus became a prison for the mind, where the mentally ill were condemned to a slow, agonizing demise, their cries unheard, their torment unseen. Even celebratory occasions, meant to be moments of joy, could be fraught with peril. Feasts, for example, while offering temporary respite from the monotony of daily diets, could be occasions for accidents. Overindulgence in alcohol could lead to brawls and injuries. The sheer volume of food preparation with its associated risks of burns and cuts would increase. And in a darker vein, feasts were also notorious settings for poisoning as rivals or enemies sought to eliminate their targets discreetly. You might attend a joyous banquet, the sounds of laughter filling the hall, but a quiet voice in your head would remind you of the potential dangers, the subtle shift in a goblet's colour, the sudden pallor on a guest's face. The very moments of supposed revelry could mask a lethal intent, turning celebration into a dance with death. The castle's defences, while protecting from large-scale attacks, offered little to no protection from the common insidious threats posed by small-scale raiders or bandits. Imagine the surrounding countryside, perhaps sparsely populated or weakened by war. Small bands of desperate individuals driven by hunger or malice could often bypass the main gates or scale less guarded sections of the walls, especially at night. You might hear the chilling tales of isolated thefts, of sudden violence against outer perimeter guards, or of smaller buildings within the outer bailey being raided. These skirmishes, though not full sieges, added a constant layer of insecurity, turning even the supposed safety of the castle into a permeable barrier where danger could seep in through unexpected cracks, ensuring that vigilance was a never-ending requirement. The psychological toll of living under constant surveillance, even if it was for your protection, was profound. In the tightly packed and hierarchical world of the castle, your every move, every interaction was likely observed and potentially reported. From the Lord's spies embedded among the servants to the watchful eyes of the guards on the wall, true privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. You might feel a constant, subtle pressure to conform to act in a way that pleased your superiors, to never truly relax your guard. This pervasive scrutiny created an atmosphere of paranoia where trust was scarce and genuine connection was difficult to forge. You learn to filter your words, to moderate your expressions, to become a master of a carefully constructed facade. This constant performance, this suppression of your true self, was a slow internal death, eroding your sense of authenticity and leaving you perpetually on edge even in moments of supposed peace. Moreover, the castle's military function dictated a rigid adherence to routines and schedules, which, while necessary for discipline, further stripped away individual autonomy. Imagine waking at the sounding of a horn, performing duties according to a strict timetable, eating at prescribed times and sleeping when permitted. There was little room for personal preference for deviation for the simple rhythms of your own body. This constant external control over your daily life, the feeling of being a cog in a larger unyielding machine, could lead to a profound sense of dehumanization. You were not a person with desires and choices, but a functionary serving the greater purpose of the fortress. This relentless regimentation while maintaining order also stifled spontaneity and individuality, contributing to the quiet despair that permeated the stone walls. The castle's very success as a defensive structure could paradoxically make it a target. A powerful, well-defended castle was a prize tempting ambitious warlords and rival nobles to launch devastating sieges. This meant that the stronger and more renowned a castle became, the more likely it was to endure brutal, prolonged assaults. You might live in constant fear of the next siege, knowing that your home, a symbol of strength, was also a beacon for destruction. The very features that made it formidable also made it a magnet for violence, trapping its inhabitants in a cycle of defensive struggle that could culminate in starvation, disease, or a brutal breach. Your safety, you realize, was inversely proportional to the castle's perceived might. The stronger it looked, the more dangerous it was to inhabit. And the castle's internal conflicts, though less dramatic than external sieges, were often far more insidious and personal. Disputes over land honour or loyalty among the lord's inner circle, his knights, his family members, his most trusted advisors could erupt into deadly feuds. Imagine a whispered accusation, a perceived slight, escalating into a duel to the death in the courtyard, or a quiet poisoning in the night. These internecine conflicts, born from ambition and power struggles, meant that danger could come from within, from those you were supposed to trust. The castle in its close confines magnified these personal enmities, turning a private disagreement into a potentially lethal situation for all involved. You learn to navigate the delicate dance of court politics, to be wary of alliances, and to trust no one, fully knowing that betrayal could come from any direction. Even the architecture's focus on long-term defence, such as deep cellars for food storage, could create hidden dangers. These often unventilated damp spaces were perfect breeding grounds for mildew, mould and rot, contaminating stored provisions and contributing to the spread of disease. You might be sent down into a cellar, feeling the heavy cloying air, seeing the fungal growth on the walls, and knowing that the very food intended to sustain you during a siege could be slowly poisoning you. The attempt to create resilience inadvertently created new vulnerabilities, turning a life-saving resource into a source of quiet, insidious peril. It was another layer of the castle's paradoxical nature, where every solution seemed to spawn a new problem. The very success of the castle in repelling external threats could lead to a false sense of security regarding internal ones. Imagine the guards, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for enemy banners, yet perhaps less vigilant about who was coming and going within the inner bailey, or what activities transpired in the darkened corridors. This focus on the external foe meant that internal dissent, sabotage, or even simple negligence could fester unnoticed until it was too late. A disgruntled servant might subtly spoil provisions, or a disloyal guard might leave a gate unbarred, not out of malice but carelessness. The castle's protective shell, while robust against a battering ram, was surprisingly vulnerable to the quiet corrosion of human error and internal discontent, turning supposed security into another form of death trap. Consider also the limitations imposed by the castle's very construction on the physical growth and well-being of its inhabitants. Growing up within these walls, particularly for children, meant limited exposure to open spaces, fresh air, and varied physical activity. Instead of wide-open fields, you had cramped courtyards. Instead of free movement, you had constricted passages and steep stairs. This could lead to a host of physical ailments, stunted growth, respiratory issues exacerbated by the stale air, skeletal deformities from malnutrition and lack of sunlight, and a general lack of physical robustness compared to those who lived more freely outdoors. The castle, while protecting you from immediate physical harm from invaders, was subtly undermining your long-term health, building a foundation for a shorter, less vigorous life. The lack of effective waste disposal for non-human refuse such as animal bones, kitchen scraps and general debris further contributed to the castle's unhygienic environment. Imagine huge piles of discarded matter slowly rotting in corners of the outer bailey or simply tossed into the moat, creating a constant source of stench and attracting swarms of insects and vermin. These heaps of refuse became breeding grounds for disease, constantly reintroducing pathogens into the castle ecosystem. The sheer volume of waste generated by a large castle population, coupled with primitive disposal methods, meant that the fortress was constantly fighting a losing battle against its own byproducts, a slow, festering death trap woven into the fabric of daily life. Even the supply lines crucial for provisioning the castle during peace and war were a constant source of anxiety and potential danger. Imagine convoys of food, fuel and supplies moving through dangerous, often bandit-infested countryside vulnerable to ambush. If these supply lines were cut, the castle, no matter how well defended, would quickly face starvation. The fear of an intercepted convoy of dwindling supplies was a constant low-level dread that hung over everyone in the castle, from the lord to the lowest servant. Your very survival depended on forces and events far beyond the castle walls, making the fortress, in this sense, a hostage to its external connections, a death trap if those connections were severed. And finally, consider the psychological impact of living in a world constantly on the brink of violence. Even in peacetime, the castle was a military establishment always prepared for war. This meant constant drills, the presence of armed soldiers, the clang of weapons, and the knowledge that at any moment conflict could erupt. This pervasive atmosphere of readiness for violence, while necessary for defence, also created a heightened state of alert, a constant underlying tension. You might find yourself unconsciously flinching at loud noises, or scanning your surroundings for threats even when there were none. This hypervigilance, this inability to ever truly relax, was a profound psychological burden, slowly eroding your peace of mind and leading to chronic stress. The castle in its very essence was a monument to conflict, and living within its walls meant living in a constant state of preparedness for the horrors of war even when peace prevailed. The castle's economic model centred around the lord's personal wealth, and the agricultural output of his domain meant that any personal financial misjudgment by the lord could have catastrophic ripple effects. If the lord gambled unwisely, invested poorly, or simply spent too lavishly, the consequences would not just be his own. His debts would eventually trickle down, forcing him to levy heavier taxes on his peasants, to reduce the rations for his household, or even to sell off portions of his land and retinue. This meant that the castle's entire population was in essence financially vulnerable to the lord's personal decisions, turning his private economic habits into a potential death trap for his entire domain. You might witness the slow decline, the tightening of belts, the gradual impoverishment of the populace, all stemming from a lord's inability to manage his own coffers, demonstrating how deeply interconnected every aspect of castle life truly was. Moreover, the feudal system's emphasis on inherited power rather than merit meant that an incompetent or cruel lord could by birthright hold absolute sway over the lives of hundreds or thousands. Imagine a lord who is not strategically astute, or one who rules with unchecked brutality driven by paranoia or simple sadism. There would be little recourse for his subjects, no legal mechanism for removal, no appeal to a higher authority that could effectively intervene. Your life, your welfare, and your very survival would be entirely dependent on the character or lack thereof of a single individual. This inherent flaw in the system, the possibility of being trapped under the rule of a truly terrible lord, was a profound and inescapable death trap, condemning generations to misery and potential ruin through no fault of their own, but simply by the accident of their birth into that particular lord's domain. The very physical security of the castle could also foster a sense of false bravado or isolationism in its lord. Confident in his impregnable fortress, a lord might become less inclined to forge alliances to engage in diplomacy or to seek peaceful resolutions to conflicts. This insular mindset, born from the perceived safety of his stone walls, could lead to prolonged feuds, unnecessary wars, and ultimately the exhaustion of his resources and the decimation of his people. The castle, rather than encouraging strategic thinking and cooperation, could inadvertently become a catalyst for stubbornness and isolation, leading to its eventual downfall and dragging all its inhabitants with it into ruin. And consider the psychological burden of being a hostage within your own home. During sieges or times of severe unrest, the castle gates would be barred, turning the fortress into an impenetrable cage. You could not leave. You could not escape the constant presence of your superiors, the lack of privacy, the dwindling resources, or the pervasive fear. This feeling of being trapped, of having your freedom utterly curtailed, was a profound psychological death trap. It could lead to cabin fever, desperate attempts at escape, or a profound sense of resignation, a quiet acceptance of your fate, whatever it might be. The castle, designed to keep enemies out simultaneously, became an unbreakable barrier, keeping its inhabitants and condemning them to whatever fate awaited within its walls. Finally, the castle's purpose as a symbol of dominance often involved its participation in brutal acts of warfare and conquest. Beyond mere defence, castles served as bases from which lords launched raids, besieged rival strongholds, and maintained control over conquered territories through force. This meant that even if you were not directly involved in the fighting, you were part of a system that perpetuated violence. The castle was a nexus of power and aggression, and living within its sphere meant being complicit in, or at least exposed to, the grim realities of medieval warfare. The bloodshed, the suffering, the loss of life that resulted from these campaigns would directly or indirectly impact those within the castle through the arrival of wounded soldiers, the tales of brutality, or the constant threat of retaliation. The very symbol of your protection was also an active participant in the death and destruction of the age. Even the seemingly noble act of protecting a realm, or a lineage through the castle's might, came with its own hidden tolls. The constant readiness for war meant that a significant portion of the castle's resources, both human and material, were dedicated to military training equipment and maintaining a fighting force. This diversion of resources meant less investment in agriculture and education, or in the general well-being of the populace. You might see young men barely out of boyhood trained for brutal combat, their lives destined for the battlefield rather than the forge or the field. The castle, in its unwavering commitment to defence and dominion, inadvertently sacrificed the flourishing of other aspects of human life, creating a less vibrant, more brutal society, where the sword often overshadowed the plough. The sheer noise of daily castle life, often overlooked, contributed to its pervasive mental strain. Imagine the constant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of the guards, the barking of dogs, the squawking of chickens and other livestock, the creaking of carts, the general hubbub of a crowded working fortress. In the stone echo chambers of the castle, these sounds would be amplified, creating a cacophony that rarely ceased. This constant auditory assault could lead to chronic stress, irritability, and difficulty concentrating. You might find yourself longing for genuine silence, for a moment of quiet repose, but the castle denied you even that. It was a sensory overload, a relentless reminder of the crowded, busy, and often chaotic reality of your existence, preventing your mind from ever truly resting. The lack of personal autonomy extended even to matters of appearance and personal freedom of movement. Your clothing, dictated by social standing and practical necessity, was often uncomfortable, restrictive, and difficult to keep clean. Imagine stiff fabrics, rough textures, and designs that prioritized warmth or durability over ease of movement or comfort. You might find yourself constantly itching, or feeling constricted, another subtle physical discomfort, adding to the daily grind. Your movements within the castle were also implicitly constrained certain areas reserved for the lord, others for specific functions, limiting your personal exploration or escape. This constant physical and sartorial restriction, though seemingly minor, contributed to the pervasive feeling of being trapped, of not truly owning your own body or your own space. And the castle's very longevity meant that it became a repository of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. The weight of generations of suffering of lives lived and lost within its walls imbued the stone with a sombre atmosphere. You might hear tales of former inhabitants, of tragedies, of haunting spirits, and while some were mere superstition, they added to the oppressive psychological environment. The castle was not just a structure, it was a living monument to its past, and that past was often fraught with pain, violence, and despair. You might feel the weight of history in its shadowed corridors, a sense of unseen presences, a quiet chill that had nothing to do with the temperature but everything to do with the countless lives that had been lived and ended within its unyielding embrace. The final lingering thought is that the castle, for all its perceived might and glory, was a testament to a brutal reality that human ingenuity, when applied solely to defence and control, can inadvertently create structures that, while protecting against one set of dangers, unleash a myriad of others upon those they were meant to shelter. It transformed survival into a daily grinding struggle, a constant gamble with forces both seen and unseen, and for many it was a slow, agonizing descent into physical and psychological ruin. The romanticized image of knights and ladies fades, replaced by the grim, unvarnished portrait of a true death trap in stone. As the last echoes of the castle's history begin to soften, you can feel the quiet peace of your own space settling around you once more. The biting cold of the stone walls, the lingering stench of unwashed bodies and damp earth, the anxious hum of constant vigilance, all these sensations gently recede, melting away into the comforting warmth and safety of your present. No longer do you need to worry about contaminated water or the sudden collapse of a centuries-old beam, or the unseen diseases lurking in the shadows. Your mind, which has navigated the treacherous paths of medieval life, can now find solace in the simple yet profound luxuries of your modern existence. A clean, warm bed, the soft glow of a lamp, the knowledge that fresh, safe water is readily available. Let the images of stone and steel, of struggle and survival, gently fade from your thoughts like mist over an ancient moat. Allow your breath to deepen to steady, knowing that the dangers of that distant past are exactly where they belong, in the pages of history, not in the quiet of your night. You are safe. You are warm, and as the world outside continues its gentle slumber, so too can your own mind begin its peaceful drift. Close your eyes, dear dreamer, and rest.